Thank you, everybody, for showing up on Memorial Day Monday. Somebody asked a couple of minutes ago about, last Wednesday. Obviously, we're, 5 or 6 days out from the tragic events. And one of the very minor, in my opinion, but one of the thread lines was that Yaron, the man who was killed, his Jewish identity has sort of been, subject of debate in the Jewish community. And maybe we'll return to this in about, 25, 30 minutes. But just to give the facts for people that might not have been, reading all the background about their identity, Yaron was an Israeli citizen whose mother was Christian and father was Jewish, who identified as Christian, who was about to get engaged to a Jewish woman, which very much, I think, just gives you a snapshot of the complexity of modern Jewish identity, in all of the most, one from him as a person, fascinating ways, and in terms of the anti-Semitism in the most tragic ways. And I wanted to do a deep dive, not on your own specifically, but on this wider topic. For people who were here last Monday, the angle that we were going at from last Monday, just to give the 2-minute review, is how does internal Jewish tradition see Jewish identity? And we talked about all sorts of debates in the ancient world. There's debates are intra-Tanakh, so you have the perspective of Ezra and Nehemiah versus the perspective of Ruth. You have different debates in the Talmud about what makes somebody Jewish. Is it both parents being Jewish? Is it some sort of belief? Is there some sort of, inherent ethnic identity of being Jewish? We saw Judah Halevi versus Maimonides and all of these different thinkers that were, intellectually battling it out over the last couple thousand years. And it's no surprise to anybody here that Jewish tradition still internally has not come up with a definitive answer to what makes somebody Jewish. And we'll return to that topic next week when we talk about, practical ramifications of this. But that is only half the story. In other words, when talking about who is a Jew or how do we define Judaism or who is included within, counting of the Jewish people, half of the story, and this is, according to all conceptions of, group sociology, when you want to figure out who a group is, you have to ask it from two perspectives. One, you ask internally, how does a group self-define? In other words, who do I consider part of my group? And then the flip side is externally. How do others see my group? And so last week we were talking about internal Jewish perspectives on who is a Jew. And today, the other half of the question that is equally, if not even slightly more important for contemporary Jewish identity is how has the outside world seen Jews and Jewish identity over the last 2,000 years? And it turns out that I want to do 3 case studies today. I'm going to guess that some of us might be more familiar with, 1 or 2 of them. And through these 3 historic case studies and 3 events that happened to the Jewish people, we'll see that this has not been an easy question for the wider public to answer either. In other words, both there's been confusion internally in the Jewish community throughout history of who exactly are Jews, how do we define them? And we'll see in a minute from the quote-unquote wider non-Jewish public, there's also been a lot of confusion over who are Jews and how do we define them. And so I'm going to share my screen for a second. I'm going to Okay. So I want to drop us into one of what our first of 3 episodes, and hopefully we'll spend about 20-25 minutes on each historic episode. And through these episodes, again, the goal is to paint an even more confusing perspective of Jewish identity through these 3 historic episodes. So bear with me. A tiny bit of historic background before we talk about the expulsion from Spain and subsequent Inquisition is that in the medieval period, Spain was very much the center of Jewish intellectual and cultural life. And so one way to think of Jewish history is that at different times in Jewish history, there's been different centers. Again, having a center does not mean that all Jews live in that center, but if we took a time machine to the year 0, the center would obviously be Jerusalem. If we took a time machine to the year 300 CE, the center would be in the yeshivot in Babylonia. And if we took a time machine to the year 1000, the Jewish center would almost certainly be sprinkled throughout the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, with thinkers like Judah Halevi and Nachmanides and Maimonides and all of these, great heavy hitters. And so the Jewish community in Spain was one of the most robust Jewish communities in the Middle Ages. And again, just from a little bit of our world history, Spain was constantly at the center of a war between the Islamic world pushing up from North Africa and the Christian world pushing back down from the rest of Europe. And Jews were very much caught in this. But despite that, Jewish life in Spain in general, again, I'm going to make a generalization, was pretty great. I always joke when I'm talking about, this with undergrads, that if you have to be reincarnated as a Jew in the 1100s somewhere, you should pick Spain every time, right? You're going to have better luck in Spain than anywhere in North Africa or anywhere in the rest of Europe. And things started to change, in the late 14th century, where a series of pogroms and series of riots begin throughout, starting in northern Spain, but then going down south as sort of one of the last legs of the Reconquista, where tens of thousands of Jews started to be murdered across 70 cities within Spain. And so very much you have this historic episode where Jewish life in Spain goes from being probably the best situation that Jews have ever had historically to about 100, 200 years later. By the 1390s, there starts to be these massive pogroms against Jewish community. And these pogroms start to come with a little bit of implicit pressure of, if Jews convert to Christianity, then Jews will be safe. And so you already start to see this tension that, we do have a little bit of this tension during the First Crusades in France and Germany in the 11 and 1200s. But starting in the 1390s, in Spain, you start to have this big question that starts to circulate among the Jewish community of, our lives are at risk if we continue our identity as Jews. And the way to get out of that is to convert to Christianity. And then not just us, but our children and our entire community will be safe, right? So this was the question that was looming amongst the Jewish community in Spain starting in 1391. This lasted for about 100 years. I'm going to fast forward the history here so we can get through the interesting ideological situation in a second. 101 years later, in 1492, Spain declared the infamous Alhambra Decree, which was an explicit decree that anybody still identifying as Jewish in 1492 was either going to be killed or had to leave. And so Jews now have this question faced much more explicitly 100 years later, which is, if you want to stay in Spain, you need to convert to Christianity as a Jew. And again, this is not the time to, blame or to, ask ourselves what we would have done. But around 200,000 Jews within Spain, which is a huge number for the 1400s, right? Populations were not nearly the size as they were now. And some estimates say this is about 60% of the Jews that were in Spain. 200,000 Jews in 1492, or over the course of this 100 years, decide to make the decision to convert to Christianity, and 100,000 Jews decide to make the decision to leave. It's another fascinating historic episode of what happened to these 100,000 Jews who left. Some went to the new Americas, some went to Amsterdam, some of them joined the Ashkenazi world, some ended up going to the Ottoman Empire. That's another historic tangent, but I want to focus on these 200,000 Jews who converted to Christianity, because this was, within Jewish history, the singular largest number of Jews who converted out of Judaism throughout Jewish history. Now, I've already said something that, some of you should, take issue with, which is Jews converting out of Judaism. And so I want to do a deep dive on this, and you'll see not just from an internal Jewish perspective, but from the point of view of the church and the Inquisition. This ended up throwing a first major wrench in Jewish identity, so much so that many historians talk about 1492 as being the inflection point within Jewish history from medieval to modern. In other words, what started the modern age of Judaism? It was the 1492 switch of Judaism under the Inquisition. And so there's a couple different ways to think about this, but I want to talk about this from, a little bit of a historic perspective. And I'm drawing on the research of David Graysboard, who is a Jewish studies professor at University of Arizona. His background is he is a Sephardic Jew, and he is the world expert in the Inquisition and Jewish identity. And he writes a series of fascinating articles, but he starts with talking about this idea that Christianity has had from the outset, that Judaism rejected from the outset, which is this idea of dualism, drawing on the Greek difference between matter and form. Now, if I've completely lost everybody, don't worry, let's take a step back. The ancient Greeks, starting with Plato, imagined that the world was two completely different substances that don't really interact. There's a world of matter, right? Matter is stuff, right? This cup is matter. This microphone is matter. My glasses are matter. And then there's form. Form are things that are non-physical, right? Things like ideas, or things like, is there such a thing as a Platonic cup that's not, a physical cup, but is there some ideal of a cup that we can imagine? Probably more decipherable is, as this evolves into Christian thought, this very much becomes seen as the flesh versus the spirit. In other words, you have the physical world of us as physical humans and you have objects, but then you have an entire other world that's the world of spirituality. And Christianity is in some way very much predicated on this dualism where you have the physical world and then you have the spiritual world, and these two worlds are completely different and at times even have nothing to do with each other. And the implication is that the world of matter and the world of flesh is an inferior world. And so, you have that famous line in the New Testament, give to Caesar unto Caesar. In other words, from the New Testament and early Christians' perspectives, we're not interested in politics, right? Politics is the stuff of matter. It's the stuff of flesh. It's the stuff of this world. We are interested in the spiritual world. We are interested in creating this sort of ideal type of thinking about the world, right? It's one of the reasons why Christianity tends to focus more on questions of heaven than Judaism does. And David Graysboard's ultimate point is that early Judaism very much rejected this distinction, right? Judaism does not, you can scour the Tanakh and scour the Talmud, and obviously Jews understood concepts of things being physical and things being, ideas or spiritual based. But generally speaking, true to Judaism's nature was a rejection of this dichotomy between matter and form. And how do we know that? Because while Christianity early on in the New Testament and Paul said, well, the law, in other words, all these physical rituals that you're doing, right, that doesn't matter so much. What matters is the belief. What matters is the spirituality. Judaism was saying, no, no, no. This world and our rituals, that is our path to a higher religious sense. And so Judaism very much rejects this idea. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this point, but it's going to be very interesting in a second when it hits the Inquisition head on. And David Graysboard has this fascinating quote that I just want to read into, and then I'll discuss what ends up happening during the Inquisition just with this ideological background. So he says, Hellenic dualism, in other words, from the Greco-Roman tradition, did become a primary shaping component of Christianity and hence of Christian understandings of Jews. According to the Pauline letters, for instance, non-Judeans' adoption of the belief that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah signaled that the old Israel of the flesh had been superseded by a new, multinational, indeed unnational Israel of the Spirit. Paul had it that a majority of the carnal Israel had forsaken God and thus ensured that the Judean people's perdition, at least until the emergence from within its own ranks of a saving remnant. In Pauline Christianity, not only could one be Israel and not a Judean then, but membership in the spiritual Israel versus, what he would call carnal Israel effaced all national distinctions to forge a single, undifferentiated body of believers. In other words, right, that's a lot of academic jargon there. Just to take a step back, one of the main points that the New Testament and early Christians with Paul at the forefront were making is that our new idea of what Israel even is a non-physical idea, right? You take the idea of Israel in the Tanakh, or what the rabbinic idea of who was Israel. Again, our question from last week, who is a Jew? Who was part of the Israel community? And Jews would have talked about some sort of ethnic idea of, children of Abraham, and we are a people, right? We are a nation. We are part of the Judean people from the area of Judea, right? A very physical idea of what it means to be a Jew. With the New Testament's differentiation between, well, no, you have the spirit and you have the flesh. The entire idea of the New Testament essentially is that Israel no longer represented a ethnic people. Israel was sort of this wider transnational or multinational ideal, so much so that there are lines in early church fathers that explicitly say the Jews are actually no longer the Jews, right? The Jews are these, ancient carnal Israel people, but real Judaism or real Israel has actually superseded Jewish identity. And so just taking a step back with this framework, Christianity emerges as this transnational spiritual community, while Judaism never had this distinction. So just to put all the pieces together, and then I'll take a couple questions before we deep dive into how the Inquisition actually ends up really litigating this question in the public sphere in Europe. And, I would argue this is probably the most important event for understanding contemporary anti-Semitism that's ever happened in Jewish history. On one side, you have Jews who rejected distinction between matter and form, and Jews have always seen ourselves as having part ethnic, part religious, and untangling that is very difficult. We saw that last week. Christianity came with this very neat bifurcation of you have the world of spirit and you have the world of physicality, and Jews are now, because they have denied the quote unquote new truth, they are only the world of flesh, but they are not now the world of spirituality. And so this is now setting the stage for when the Inquisition happens, some really interesting implications for Judaism. But I'll take a step back. I know this is a little bit of a complicated framework, but I think it'll become clear on the next slide. But I'll take 2 minutes for questions or clarifications on this um, before I go on. Perfect. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, and then I think this will become clear in a minute. So the Inquisition. So what was the Inquisition? So something interesting happens, right? 200,000 Jews in 1492 decide to convert to Christianity. But what does that essentially mean? It means you have 200,000 people who were part of what the New Testament would call carnal Israel, right? Ethnic Jews who all of a sudden convert to Christianity, right? Accepting the message of, spiritual Israel. So from the point of view of Christianity, you would think, okay, great. Case closed. All that matters is the spirituality. So if a Jew converts to Christianity from the perspective of the Christian world, they should be considered fully Christian. And that is what happened early on. And so Christianity in the medieval ages was more than happy to accept Jewish converts to Christianity. And there was no tension there, right? If a Jew decided to convert to Christianity in the medieval period, the church welcomed them with open arms, and end of story. And then over time during the Inquisition, this category of people who we would call ethnic Jews and religious Christians started growing, right? You have 2,000 of them between 1391 and 1492. And now you have people that are caught in this very interesting situation because for Christians, they were Christians, but for Jews, they were Jews. In other words, if you asked your average Christian in the year 1450, let's say I decided to convert to Christianity. And so you went to the local church and you said, is Daniel a Christian? The local church would say, of course, Daniel's a Christian. He has accepted the faith of Christianity and therefore he is a Christian. And then you go and ask the community rabbi, is Daniel still Jewish? And the rabbi would say, yes, Daniel's mother was halachically Jewish. Therefore, Daniel is still Jewish in all intents and purposes. And you have some really interesting response. This even goes back to the early Ashkenazi period, but you have this famous letter that Rashi, the French sage during the Crusades, where Rashi's dealing with a similar tension of Jewish identity. And Rashi explicitly tells us, even if a Jew converts out of Judaism, he is still Jewish. And then he says, how much more so is this the case of a Jew who forcibly converted to a different religion? And so already we're starting to get these fuzzy categories where, just to take a step back, if Jewish primary identity is a fusion of what we would call matter and form, and for Christian identity, there's a full differentiation, you can actually get people, aka a Jew who converts to Christianity, who from a Jewish perspective are fully Jewish, and from a Christian perspective are fully Christian. And this tension could only last so long until something happens because of it. So what happened because of it? You started to get tens of thousands of Jews after 1492, after the Alhambra decree. Again, for obvious historic purposes, we don't know the exact number because definitionally, if people were pretending to be Christian while continuing to practice Judaism, that wouldn't be something that would, pop up in census data. But you started getting thousands, if not tens of thousands of Jews during the Inquisition who said, you know what? I'll convert to Christianity, right? I want to protect, my life and my family and my kids. And I like Spain, right? I have a nice house in Barcelona, so, it would be really inconvenient to leave now. And yeah, I'll convert to Christianity externally. I'll stop showing up to synagogue and I'll go to church and I'll, do all the public confessional dogmas of Christianity in the public sphere. But deep down, I know that I'm still Jewish, right? Jewish identity is not primarily dogma based. And so, in the church, I can say I believe X, Y, or Z, and then I'll go home and, I'll have a covert Passover Seder or covertly light the Shabbat candles. And so some percentages of Jews were doing this, and the church catches on. And the church says, well, we need to actually figure out a way to inquire who was doing this, right? All of a sudden, you have 200,000 Jews who say they converted to Christianity, but we really suspect that at least some percentage of them are still practicing Judaism. So the Inquisition is born. And for the next 150, 200 years in Europe, anybody who was a Jewish convert to Christianity, a Judeo-converso, or the descendants of a Judeo-converso, became the object of the Inquisition. And so all of a sudden you have somebody, you have Shirley, and Shirley promises that she's Christian, right? She's obviously her background is obviously Jewish, but she converted to Christianity. The Inquisition's still going to say, well, there's still a chance that you're hiding and you're being a covert Jew. Even more so, right? Your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandchildren, the Inquisition is going to say, well, there is a chance that they are still practicing Judaism. Why? Because they have Jewish ethnicity, right? So here is where the kicker happens. All of a sudden, Christianity for the longest time saw Jews as, right, ethnically Jews, but if they convert, they are fully accepted into Christianity. But all of a sudden, during the Inquisition, the very idea of somebody being an ethnic Jew tainted them, even if they converted out of Judaism. And so from the church's point of view, all of a sudden you have people who descended from Jews, right? If my great-grandchildren, right, in Barcelona in the year 1570 had been living as Christians for 3 generations, the Inquisition would still say, well, we have in their records that your grandfather was Jewish and your grandfather was, a rabbi in Barcelona, say in 1480 or 1490. So we're not convinced that you're really Christian, right? But what does that mean that you're really Christian? It means that somebody who's an ethnic Jew might be, privately or under the cover having this, and I'll use the term conspiracy because this is how this ends up getting repackaged into later anti-Semitic formulations. But can we really trust somebody, right? This is what the Inquisition was saying, who is from ethnic Jewish heritage. Can we really trust what they say? Or do we have to be constantly worried that privately the Jews have this scheme where they're actually trying to subvert the goal of what our wider community is trying to do, right? So all of a sudden you get not just this differentiation between religious Jew and ethnic Jew, you also get the underpinnings of a lot of conspiracies that are at the root of modern anti-Semitism. In other words, you can see this, pop up in politics today. Yes, the Jewish community says publicly that they are, loyal, parts of liberal democracy, and Jews are engaged in business and everything that you would imagine, good capitalists to be engaged in. But are we really sure that, privately the Jews aren't actually trying to push a Marxist communist view through George Soros's money, right? Obviously the implications are a little bit different, but the thought process is the exact same. And that's not the only thing that happened here. All of a sudden, you have probably out of 200,000 people, let's say 180,000 of them authentically converted. What do I mean by authentically converted? These were Jews who, after the Inquisition, right? I'm not saying that they all of a sudden accepted the tenets of Christian dogmatism, but for these Jews, just like I would imagine a lot of Jews would decide today, it just wasn't worth it for them to continue their Jewish identity in the face of this much adversity. And so they weren't practicing Judaism in secret. They fully became Christian. And their children and grandchildren might not have even known that their grandfather was Jewish. But still, for these people, the Inquisition in their books had them down as ethnic Jews. And so all of a sudden, this full difference began to happen where before the Inquisition, if we take the church in the year 1200, from the point of view of the church, Jews were a religious community that if they converted out of their incorrect religion, aka Judaism, and accepted the correct religion, aka Christianity, their ethnicity didn't matter. Again, Christianity very much undervalued the flesh or the matter, right? That was not important for early Christians. All that mattered is you had the correct beliefs. And so a Jew in the 1200s can convert to Christianity and bam, they are fully Christian for all intents and purposes. Starting with the Inquisition, 1500s and 1600s, this became a lot more difficult to tease out. And the Christian world, and by the Christian world, I mean basically all of Europe, which was Christian at this point, began seeing Jews as, well, there's a religious component of Jews, right? There's the rejection of Christianity and, the desire to continue to practice, the Mosaic and Talmudic law. That's the religious part of Judaism. But then there's also the ethnic part of Judaism that all of a sudden really matters, right? In the 1200s, it didn't matter, but all of a sudden now it matters whether or not you have Jewish ethnicity because there's something about ethnic Jews that still there's a much higher percent chance that they're still engaged in something Jewish, and maybe that's behind the scenes, and maybe we can't really explicitly see that, but we know deep down that if somebody's an ethnic Jew, we should trust them a little bit less, right? That was the point of view of the Inquisition. The last thing I'll say here is that this is really difficult to tease out, because let's give another case study. Let's say I'm a rabbi in Barcelona in the year 1480, and I make the decision. The Inquisition comes in, and the Alhambra decree is passed, and I say, you know what? For the good of my family, I'm just going to convert to Christianity, and I'm not even going to covertly practice Judaism. And so, great. I'm accepted as a Christian, right? And then I have kids, right? I have grandkids. I have a family, and I've completely, turned my back on Judaism. I have no desire or no pretense that I'm ever going to re-practice Judaism. But we know this today. Separating religion from culture is very difficult. So the example that I always give is, let's say, for obvious reasons, I just don't have any family recipes for cooking pork, right? It used to be because of religious reasons, right? The Torah says don't eat pork. But now that I've converted to Christianity, it's just I've never cooked it before. I don't know how to cook pork. I wouldn't know where to start if somebody gave me a slab of pork or, a bacon strip. I just wouldn't know what to do with it. And I didn't grow up with it anyway. So, whatever. I've never eaten bacon. And so, when I'm teaching my kids how to cook, I also, teach them all the family recipes, but just never teach them how to make pork. And then one day the Inquisition realizes, Daniel Jr. in the year 1512, I'm picking a random year, we've noticed he's never purchased pork before from the market. That's very odd because Spain is a country where there's a lot of pig eaten. By the way, you take a vacation to Spain in 2025, there's a disproportionate amount of pig that's eaten in Spain, and a lot of historians actually connect this as a way for the Inquisition to root out Jews. And so the cuisine of Spain became very centered around pig because the Inquisition figured that Jews would still have this visceral reaction to eating pork. It's one of the reasons why there's so much pig eaten in Spain. That's a completely tangent for another time. But all of a sudden, Daniel Jr., the Inquisition realizes Daniel Jr. has never purchased pork before. So the Inquisition opens up a inquiry and decides Daniel Jr. is still practicing Judaism covertly because they've never eaten pork. Now, from Daniel Jr.'s perspective, they're not Jewish. They might not even know they're Jewish, right? What if I never even told my kids that I used to be Jewish? But from the Inquisition's perspective, because they are an ethnic Jew and because they are still practicing some of the, vestiges of Jewish culture and religion, they're seen as Jewish. So now you take a snapshot of Europe in the 15 and 1600s and you ask, well, who is a Jew? That's a very complicated question because that question always, now you need to ask two questions. Who is a Jew when you're talking about religion, and who is a Jew when you're talking about ethnicity? And these are actually two different conversations. And so from the church's point of view, Jewish identity was both on the spectrum of religious and the spectrum of ethnic. And this would obviously have very dire consequences moving forward for this idea of, are Jews a religion who can convert out of Judaism? Or is there something, essentialized within Judaism, call it ethnic, call it blood, call it racial? One of the other interesting things, just to take one step back and then I'll take some questions, this debate in some way mirrors the debate that we saw from Ezra and Ruth last week, but this is happening externally. In other words, just like Jews have always been arguing, we have the ethnic and we have the religious component, and which one outweighs the other. All of a sudden now this started to be litigated within wider Europe. And from the point of view of the Inquisition and the church, and then later on modern Europe, and then one could argue the modern West, they're still confused at this point of, is Jewish identity religious? Is Jewish identity ethnic? But the Inquisition gives a fascinating case study of even when Jews opt to convert out of Judaism into a religion that should, by its own standard, fully accept them uncritically as Christians, there's still this idea of, well, there's something inherent within Jews that makes them a little bit less trustworthy, and they might be actually trying to subvert this whole project. And so the ethnicity component of Judaism actually remains, even as Jews try to completely throw off their religious identity. Okay, I said a lot. Any thoughts or questions on this first chapter of Jewish identity? Rhea, go for it.
Okay, so that you've discussed about the view of all of this from the Christian perspective. And what I wanted to ask was, I know there probably were during the Inquisition I don't know if there were any Jews left in Spain who identified as Jews. So Um, I wanted to know, what did the Jewish community, even the worldwide Jewish community, think about the conversos? Did they think that they were still Jewish, even though they had supposedly converted to Christianity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So essentially, the worldwide Jewish community still saw them as Jewish. I mean, as halachically Jewish. What that actually means is unclear. But you do have cases, and you actually had cases of this earlier on. The Inquisition is the most radical formulation of this, but there were many versions of this that happened all throughout Jewish history during the Crusades, when we're talking about Germany and France, and even a little bit in Spain during some of the more radical Islamic rules, such as the Berber conquest, where you would have, a situation, and this is what Rashi was talking about in the year 1096. You have a Jewish town in Germany or France. And all of a sudden, the Crusades comes, marching through. And one of the things we know from the Crusades is, especially the first Crusades, was on the march to Jerusalem. Anytime they encountered a Jewish town or village, it would sort of be open season, right? There were obviously no laws protecting Jews in these countries, and the some of the poems and first accounts that we have from the Crusades are they are just as sad and terrible as anything you read from the Holocaust, in the 1930s, right? Just really awful, rounding up all the Jews to the synagogue and then lighting it on fire, stuff like that. And so you had a lot of Jewish communities that, when they got word that, well, in 2 weeks from now, this giant Crusader army is going to come, let's just all convert to Christianity, right? Take down all obvious signs of being Jewish, right? They didn't have, internet back then. It's not like anybody can say, well, on Facebook, Shirley posted that she was having Hanukkah, right? Like, just completely pretend to be Christian and, just essentially live your life as Christians and, remove all public symbols, and everybody starts to practice Christianity. And, again, this creates this interesting tension where, the Crusader army comes through and, maybe 6 or 7 months later, some in the Jewish community maybe even keep their Christian identity because they realize, well, life is socially much better in France and Germany as a Christian than it is as a Jew. And then others decide, okay, danger is over. Let's, put on the kippah back and be Jewish. And Jewish thinkers were dealing with this of, okay, well, what's the status? Can Jews just kind of turn on and off Jewish identity based off of, and most Jewish thinkers slash almost all of them said, no, you can convert to save your life, right? That was the idea in much of the medieval Jewish community. So much so that Moses Maimonides, there's credible historic evidence, he actually lived out a couple of years of his life as a Muslim. When the Berbers came and conquered North Africa through Spain, Maimonides ended up fleeing through Morocco, and he probably lived for about 3 years as a Muslim. And, for him, and he writes this and other people writing about him, there was no conflict at all because, his life was at stake. So we know that from, Jewish sources, if your life is at stake, you can break, virtually all of Jewish law. And so you convert and then you come back. So the Jewish community very much saw this, the Judeo conversos as still Jewish. Over time, by the late 1500s or early 1600s, it was essentially a moot point anymore because anybody whose family had stayed there for that long, they completely lost their Jewish identity. But the one, very interesting practical ramification is now with modern genetic testing, you have, plenty of people who have Spanish ancestry. All of a sudden, you're doing 23andMe tests, and people are consistently that are of Spanish ancestry showing up 25, 30%, 40% Sephardic Jew. And that all goes back to this time in the Inquisition where, Jews were converting in mass. So it ends up creating this very confusing category. Sylvia, go for it.
Thanks. Thanks, Rabbi. It's been pretty good. Excellent, actually. What I'm hearing is that the perception of who is a Jew in this period, especially in the late part of the mid to late part of the 15th century and beyond, is really predicated on hatred of Jews because the conversos, all of a sudden, well, are they really Christian? But also because um, uh, back in 1492 and in the period where everybody was roaming the world because Columbus founded the New World, conversos couldn't leave Spain. They were not allowed to leave Spain. Why? Because, I mean, it seems to me that because they could go to the New World and all of a sudden become Jewish, and then there's still again this problem of having Jews in the world. Seems to me that it has nothing to do with actually who is Jewish. It's well, it has to do with who is Jewish, but not in an objective point of view. It's in a point of view of how do we get rid of them?
I think you're right, but it depends on what you mean by getting rid of them. Meaning, this might sound inflammatory, but it's, backed by, an enormous amount of historic evidence. Christianity has always been rooted in how do we get rid of the Jews, but the early Christian, how do we get rid of the Jews, was we need to convert them all to Christianity, right? This is, Paul's message in the New Testament. Paul was a Jew. He was a Pharisee, and he spends all his time writing these letters to Jews saying, there's a new message here. You have to accept this. So that was the way to, and this continued through the medieval period where there wasn't a hatred of Jews because of some ethnic or racial or national identity as Jews. It was just a belief. It was, if I think I have the right idea of, you know, God or of politics or of how the world works and you don't, I spend my day thinking, how do I convince Rhea that she's wrong and I'm right? And that was, again, I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but that was why most of the medieval conversations between Christians and Jews were these, public debates where they would send, a Jew, and then they would send a representative from the Christian community. And obviously the, scales of the debate would not be weighed evenly, but Jews would be forced to defend the dogmas of their religion versus the dogmas of Christianity. This presented an enormous problem for Jews because Jews don't really have dogmas, right? So, the Jewish community would be all flummoxed of, well, they're asking us to say exactly what Jews believe about the Messiah, but we don't, they have about 6 different opinions in the Talmud about what we believe about the Messiah. And, it's never been, a Jewish dogma of the, who exactly the Messiah is. Starting in the Inquisition, this shifted from now Jews weren't a people who were just able to be mass converted because there was still this ethnic or, this national component of Jews that even after they gave up on their individual religious connection to Judaism, Jews as a nation or Jews as an ethnic people still remained, which ended up causing a lot of problems for Jews. This whole thing was a problem for Jews, but, especially as we get into modern Europe, and when I say modern, I mean, 17, 1800s. The next slide, and then I'll take Fred's question in a second. Then I'm going to go to the next slide just so we can cover our second and third historic episode. Is when this ends up evolving into modern Europe during the Enlightenment, and as Western Europe was granting emancipation to different minority communities, there were a lot of Enlightenment thinkers in places like France and Germany and Italy and England who were saying, well, Jews are a group. Jews are a nation. Jews can't be loyal Germans because Jews constitute a Jewish nation. So why should we, German thinker in the 1840s, let's say, why should we grant Jews all the rights of Germany when Jews themselves aren't loyal to Germany? They're loyal to this wider Jewish nation, right? They have dual loyalty. Why should we grant them the full rights of Europe? Now, from the flip side, the irony is for the 400 years before that, Jews were essentially forced to have their separate state within a state, right? So this idea that Jews constitute a state within a state was used by anti-Semites in the 19th century to say we shouldn't give Jews the full benefits of citizenship because they're a state within a state. But in the 16 and 1700s, Jews were forced to be a state within the state because public services, public court systems, even police forces, they didn't help the Jews. And so if we were a Jewish community in places like Italy or England or France in the 16 and 1700s, we had to be our own autonomous community. And so, of course, if you're a Jew living in France in the 1600s, you feel a higher level of kinship for Jews living in Germany in the 1600s than you do to the nation of France or the nation of Germany. And so the criticism in the 19th century of, well, should we really give Jews full German citizenship because are Jews really going to be loyal if Germany goes to war with France? Right? That's sort of a catch-22 question because for hundreds of years, you forced the Jewish community to not have loyalty with, whatever existed in France or Germany before the nation state of French and Germany. All of a sudden, now that question is being used against the Jewish community. You're just, you're your own nation. You're your own people. You're not really French. You're not really German. And so we'll see in a second how that flipped. Fred and then Sandra, and then we're going to go to the next slide. Go for it.
I unmuted?
Yes.
I just had when you were talking about, so this is like from a historical point of view, what governments collected. It seems that there was incredible census information as to who was a Jew, who converted, given that you said generations went by and they're like, oh yeah, we still know you're the Jews. Was this kind of census information kept on all citizens or was it specific to populations that they didn't like that they could go back and look and say, we know where you came from? Uh, really, so that's my question. It just seems
Yeah.
odd that 100 years go by and they're looking and going, well, we know who you are.
So the only way, so kind of, I mean, Jews, aside from a small Muslim community, which I'll talk about maybe in a second, Jews were essentially the only minority here. I mean, we're talking about a religious minority, kind of, not an ethnic minority. So under Christendom, there really wasn't any other religious minority. Again, I'm making a generalization. Obviously, in some places there were pagans throughout history. They were, most of them were forcibly converted. There were sometimes Muslims. A lot of them were, either fled down to, the Islamic lands. And so this really was just the Jews of, one of the reasons, one of the many reasons for why anti-Semitism has been so pervasive throughout all of history is that Jews were the epitome of minority within history, both in the Christian and the Muslim world, and Jews were essentially the only minority for much of this time. There were a small number of Muslims who were also the subject of the Inquisition, but for Islam, it wasn't as tough of a question because according to Islamic self-definition, Islam is also a pure religion. So from a Muslim perspective and a Christian perspective, once you publicly convert, you don't retain any of your individual identity, right? Maybe now somebody would use the term ethnic Muslim, but it's not really a term that exists, right? You're not Muslim because your great, 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 great grandfather was a Muslim dating back to some, first Muslim, right? You date back for your great, 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 great grandfather converted to Islam or was forcibly converted to Islam, depending on the historic time. Whereas Jews, our self-definition has always been our great, 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 great grandfather was either Abraham or Judah or Israel or, from the line of people living in the land of Judea, right? Again, an ethnic definition. Now, obviously, we discussed last week, there have been people who converted into Judaism and all of that, complexity that we discussed last week on the side. But Jews were really the only community that faced this question with the full power of there are just two different definitions of Jews, one internal, one external, that hit each other. And after that, confusion begins to proliferate. Sandra, go for it.
Oh, there. Well, when I was in Amsterdam, from what I understood, that they welcomed the Jews in that era. And I went to the oldest Jewish synagogue there. It's like a museum now. It's beautiful. But and they had a lot of history there, and they were talking about that they welcomed the Jewish community. They had the biggest Jewish community in Europe at one time.
Yeah, Amsterdam in the 15 and 1600s welcomed a lot of Sephardic Jews. So a lot of Sephardic Jews, right? Spinoza is a good example, right? Spinoza's ancestry was, Sephardic and then ended up traveling through Amsterdam. One of the reasons why most of the original Jews to come to the Americas were Sephardic Jews, right, through New Amsterdam and everything there. So yeah, a lot of, one of the places that a lot of the Jews who left went was to Amsterdam. So yes, you are totally right. Okay. I want to fast forward a little bit and, kind of bring in this other piece. So for 200 or 300 years, Jews who were left in places in Western Europe, right? There was all sorts of Jews were expelled from France in the 1300s and then welcomed back into France in the 1500s, right? Jews were expelled from England, I believe, sometime in the 1200s and then welcomed back into England sometime in the 1600s. So there was a lot of Jewish expulsions and then re-welcoming back, throughout the 12, 13, 14, 15, 1600s. But by the time you get to the 1800s, there was a very visible and sizable Jewish minority living in Western Europe. And this is right on the tails of the Enlightenment. This is right after, say, the French Revolution in 1791, with ideas of the church should not hold all the power and we are going to usher in, a liberal democratic government with equal rights to all, right? Liberty was the cry of the French Revolution. And so all of a sudden you have, these new nation states beginning to form and begin to ask this question of what does it mean to be a citizen of France, right? The new nation state of France. What does it mean to be a citizen of Germany? And the Jews presented, a very inconvenient, right, case study. I'm using inconvenient in quotation marks in case you're not watching. Case study for a lot of these new countries, because from the point of view of early French and German, and then later on, English and, other types of nationalism, being part of that, nationality was only being a part of that nationality. In other words, today in America, we take it for granted somebody can be American Italian and nobody's going to say, well, what does that mean? Are you really American or really Italian? Right? Like, but hundreds of years ago, during the early stages of nationalism, it really was seen as you're either A or B. You can't have this sort of dual identity as belonging to different nations. And a lot of Jews, understandably, for the obvious historic reasons we've been painting now, saw themselves as part of a Jewish nation, right? I'm not talking about nation from the point of view of nationalism, but nation is the point of I'm a part of Am Yisrael, right? The word that we've always used, right? We've never had a term, by the way, before the 1800s. There's no word for religion in Judaism, right? The closest thing we have is the word dat, which means probably law. So we have a law in Judaism, and we have a nation, right? This idea that we are Am Yisrael, right? The people of Israel, or Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, or the Israelites. We've never had a religion of Jews. And so all of a sudden, people started looking at Jews in the 1800s and saying, well, you Jews are kind of running your own system. You have your own community here, right? Obviously, the reason why they had their own communities is because they had to be, right? Jews were pushed into ghettos throughout Western Europe. And so there were certain areas that Jews had to live in and certain jobs that Jews had to have. But all of a sudden now, during Emancipation and the Enlightenment, the wider nations were looking at Jews and they were saying, well, you're not French, right? And you seem to have no desire to become French. You are Jewish, right? You're part of this Jewish community. You have a Jewish police force. You have Jewish law. You have a Jewish town. You have Jewish tax collectors. You have certain jobs that are Jewish jobs. And you're a part of the Jewish people. You're not French. And a lot of countries were having these, internal debates of, maybe Jews shouldn't actually be given any rights in modern Europe because of this. And this ended up becoming the next really interesting episode in Jewish history to talk about this, where Napoleon, the emperor of France, following the revolution, decides to litigate this Jewish question in public. And the Jewish question is just sort of a shorthand for this wider question I'm asking. In other words, who are the Jews? Are the Jews a religion? Are the Jews a nation? Are the Jews an ethnicity? Are the Jews some sort of weird mixture? And how do we deal with this tension between Jewish identity and French identity, or Jewish identity and German identity? And so Napoleon convenes a group of 120 rabbinic leaders from around France and calls it the Grand Sanhedrin, obviously modeled after the Jerusalem Sanhedrin during the Second Temple. And he asks the rabbis a series of questions with an attempt to say, how can Jewish identity reconcile with French national identity? And a lot of scholars believe that Napoleon created Judaism. Now, let's take a step back. What do I mean by Napoleon creating Judaism? One, the term Judaism doesn't exist really before the 1800s, right? So nobody would have told you throughout Jewish history they are practicing a religion called Judaism. They would have said that they are Jewish or Judean, and they would have said that they practice Jewish law or are not practicing Jewish law, but nobody would have said that there is a religious system called Judaism that one could either turn off and on the way that we tend to think of other religious systems. So Napoleon gathers these 120 leaders, and I won't go through all of the questions, but he asks them a series of questions, right? We can just focus on a couple of them, right? Number 6. Do Jews who were born in France, who have the legal status of French citizens, regard France as their fatherland, right? That's an enormously difficult question for a Jewish community to answer, right? Think about it. 1806, 1807. Jews have only had something akin to equal rights. They weren't exactly equal for 15 years. For about 1,000 years before that, Jews in France were endlessly derided as a minority and, anti-Semitic persecution up the wazoo. All of a sudden, 15 years later, French Revolution, Jews are being asked, is your primary loyalty as your homeland to France? Or do you have other loyalties? How do you answer that if you're a Jewish community? Obviously, the politically expedient answer, the correct answer, is to say, no, of course, we're super loyal to France. But is that fair to think that the Jews would be loyal to France, right? Why would they be, right? There was no concept of equal rights in a constitution that existed for longer than 10 years there. And so by what metric were Jews, loyal to France, right? And so Jews were being forced to ask out these questions, right? We can ask, let's go to three. Can Jews marry Christians, or can Christian women marry Jews? Or does the law only allow Jews to marry among themselves, right? Another enormously complicated question. One, right, we'll just talk about from the internal Jewish perspective. Obviously, Jews have had ideas for thousands of years that Jews want to marry within the faith. When people from outside the Jewish community married in, they generally converted, right? This was the story of Ruth that we talked about last week. But it was the Christian community in the medieval period that didn't let Christians marry Jews. In other words, from the vast majority of time under the church, it was illegal for Christians to marry Jews because Jews were considered inferior. And so all of a sudden, Napoleon is asking, are Jews just, willing to fully assimilate? And if you're the Jewish community, you're thinking, well, for the last 1,000 years in Europe, we were not allowed to assimilate in any meaningful way. All of a sudden now we're being essentially asked, these questions of fully assimilate or don't assimilate at all. And so a lot of Jews understandably reworked Judaism, right? Which is why I say Napoleon invented Judaism, to say, okay, as per the definition of Western European, Enlightenment countries such as France and Germany, and then later on, one can argue America. America's a little bit of a tougher situation. Judaism actually is just a religion, and a religion that can fully accept the national identity of whatever country. So all of a sudden you have, being birthed from this is the reform movement in Germany in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. All of a sudden, German Jews saying, you're right, Judaism is just a religion. We have no national ambitions, right? This is why the early reform movement was against Zionism when it came on, as an option to respond to this in the 1800s, right? We don't want a Jewish state. And even the, sort of weirder parts of Judaism, right? All this law and rituals, right? That's less important. What's important is a religious identity called Jews, but even Jewish law is less important because now we can practice German law, and German law is a good, if not better, substitute for Jewish law. But this question began, sparking throughout the Jewish world of Jewish thinkers asking, well, what is Judaism? Does Judaism mean, if I say that I'm an American Jew, does that mean that my faith is Jewish, but my national interest is American and the legal system that I abide by is American? Does it mean that, no, I can try to have both? Can I be loyal to the Jewish nation, in other words, the Jewish people, and also a loyal American patriot? Many people throughout history have thought, no, Jews can't, right? And so the second chapter, right? So if the first chapter of Jewish history that we painted today takes Judaism from being seen as a religion to being seen as an ethnicity, this second chapter takes Judaism from being seen as an ethnicity to being seen as a religion. In other words, the exact flip. In other words, within 300 years of Jews in Western Europe, Jews started off being seen as the church as a religion. Then during the Inquisition, that evolved to being seen as an ethnic group. And then during the Enlightenment, Jews were being indicted for the fact that they see themselves as a people, aka an ethnic group, and forcing Jews to rework their self-definition to becoming a religion again. And for obvious reason, right, both of these identities still stuck, which ended up giving rise to some virulent anti-Semitism in the 18 and 1900s, all given this, dichotomy of, well, who exactly are the Jews? Well, nobody knows. The Jews are these mysterious people that, it's best to just not trust them at all, right? Because we don't even understand who they are. Why would we trust them to, be engaged in our industry, or why would we trust them to be engaged in politics? Which obviously, I know we only have a couple of minutes left. I'll stay a couple minutes extra. But the last one, I figured we don't have to spend as much time on, because the last one is one that everybody is obviously familiar with, which is Hitler's Nuremberg laws, which again, in some way takes this question to the full fold, where from Hitler, 200 years of Jews trying to essentially say, hey, we are a religion, right? We're a religion that can be full French citizens and full German citizens. And, Jews in Germany in the 1910s, 1920s were some of the most loyal German citizens. And you have Jewish writers like Hermann Cohen and Franz Rosenzweig writing in Germany in the 1920s about how Germany is the fulfillment of the Jewish messianic ideal, right? Now you have a modern nation state with liberalism and progressivism, and Jews should completely give up on all of their messianic aspirations and, Zionistic aspirations, and Jews should just become part of Germany. And now, 1933, Nuremberg laws, and we know how the story ends. Nope, Jewish definition is back to a hyper-racial definition. One Jewish grandparent is enough to indict somebody as Jewish. Jewish definition has nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with Jewish nationhood. It all has to do with ethnicity. So over the course of these three historic episodes, I'll just sort of summarize and then take some questions. We have three historic episodes being litigated from the outside, trying to figure out, who and what are Jews, and they all come at the inflection point of some, major historic unrest, wherein all three Jews get the short end of the stick, for obvious reasons. And all three of them spit out different definitions of who Jews are within the public sphere, right? In the first case, Jews are, mostly a religion, but, keep somewhat ethnicity. In Napoleon, Jews should become a religion if they want any national rights in France. In Hitler's definition, Judaism has nothing to do with religion or nationality. It only has to do with race/ethnicity. And these conversations have continued to bubble to the point where, and I said I would get back to this, and then Ray, I'll take your question. We ask ourselves a question like, was Yaron, the boy who was, tragically murdered in the terrorist attack, was he Jewish? That's a very difficult question to ask, right? From a halachic perspective, one can and should say, no, he wasn't Jewish, right? No halachic decisor would call him Jewish, and he himself didn't identify as Jewish. So it would be hard to say he's Jewish in any meaningful Jewish religious sense. Did the shooter think he was Jewish? Certainly, right? The shooter had no idea that person wasn't Jewish, and even more so, even if the shooter knew that he had this sort of mixed identity of being ethnic Jewish, religious Christian, the shooter still would have said, well, he's just part of that Jewish community anyway. And so he died as a Jew, certainly, right? Even if he didn't live as a Jew, which again, right, puts this conversation into full force. This isn't just a question that Jews have been wrestling with, but external pressure has also caused a reckoning in the Jewish community. And I know I'll take some questions, but just to conclude, and then before we take questions, I'll actually pass it to Ramarsha for a second. But just the last thing that I'll say is, in the modern period, when we're thinking of Jewish identity and who is a Jew, I would argue, and sort of the argument of next week is going to be, we both have to take into account both the internal and the external. In other words, if somebody like Yaron, or, I know hundreds of people that are in the exact same identity predicament as Yaron, right? Ethnically Jewish, but not halachically Jewish, maybe people who do identify as Jewish don't identify as Jewish, right? What happens when these things clash? The Jewish community has to provide protection for Yaron as if he was a Jew, which is exactly what the state of Israel did when it was founded in 1948. And one of the first major bills Israel passed was the right of return, which would have enshrined somebody who's ethnically Jewish but not halachically Jewish as Jewish. Now, obviously, one of the things we'll discuss next week is some of the tension points of this, which certainly exist next week as well. But this creates both a complicated internal and external picture. So I'm going to pass it to Ramarsha, and then Ray, I'll take your question, and then happy to hang out for a few minutes.
I am just Daniel, this was such a class. And again, I just, as somebody who has studied history, as I have for years, as part of my rabbinic studies, just the your incredible gift for distilling complex eras with multifaceted factors into this was, I'm going to go back and watch this many, many times, and thank you for this incredible class. And I'm so glad all of you are here to hear it and learn with me. I want to just say, as I always do, first of all, it's a gift to have people like Daniel and Rabbi David Lazar and so many other people who come teach us. And those of you who support the collaborative and make that possible, I am so grateful. If you are here for the first time, or you are able to make a small donation to the collaborative for classes like this, that would be very helpful, not required. You're always welcome. Second of all, Daniel will be back for one next class next week. And then there's
Marsha, I realize that next week is Shavuot, so maybe we let me call you and let's figure out if like a reschedule.
I wanted to ask you that. That's right. So do you want to move it to the 9th?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so because it's a Jewish holiday, well, you're welcome to join me in synagogue next Monday at 7:30 for the sunrise service. I hope all of you are going to be doing something, attending a tikkun of some kind at your synagogue or with the community. Temple Bethel is doing their annual all-night learning, starting at 7 p.m. going until 7 a.m. You're welcome to join. But the last, so thank you again for your support. And here's the incredible news. Rabbi Daniel is doing a summer Beit Midrash with us. We're going to have him for 8 weeks this summer, July and August. He's going to be piloting a course that I'll be teaching at UCI in the fall on, is it modern Jewish thought or on modern Jewish thought? And I hope you'll join us, and the registration for that will be open soon. That'll be every Monday morning at 9:30. So we're very lucky. And if you have any questions, of course, Rhea, you had a question for Daniel. We'll let you start, and then we can stay. We can leave the room open as long as Daniel's available.
I'll go for it, Rhea.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask another identity question, and it's Hebrew. When during the Second World War, people in the community, the Jewish community, where I was in Hartford, Connecticut, used the term that we are Hebrews, and I am not sure if this was external, that people identified us that way, or we identified ourselves. And I didn't know if you knew anything about this.
I only know something about it because a couple days ago I was reading for another class that I'm teaching, and I don't remember why it switched, but in the 1800s, there was a push from both the Jewish community and externally to use the term Hebrew, which fell out of favor in the last, 30, 40 years. I'm not exact. I don't remember why, but it definitely did switch. But it wasn't seen as
Yeah.
derogatory, meaning, Jews used to have, the Young Men's Hebrew Association, right? As a, there was the YMCA and then the YMHA. It doesn't ring as well. But and that was a self-definition. So it was never derogatory. It's unclear why exactly we switched. I'm sure there is some historic answer. I just don't know off the
Well,
top of my head.
there was a big concept of what were the Jews loyal to, because we were at war, and could we trust them, and were they loyal? And they didn't, and the rumor that they didn't fight in any, that the Jews did not join in the armed forces, and I think the Jewish War Veterans was formed much earlier than that,